husband started sleeping with our neighbor because he found out about my affair. Hello, Reddit. I am a newcomer here. I've always heard of this app, but I've never really used it. This is my first time posting here, and I only created an account a few weeks ago. My friend recommended it as she thought my story would be a good one to share, as people might learn a lesson from it. So here goes. I cheated on my husband, and so he cheated back with our neighbor. And not only that, but I am also probably going to lose everything in the divorce. Now I know you might be saying, oh, you deserve it and stuff like that. But to be honest, I did not come here to be shamed. I know what I did was wrong, and I have come to terms with it a long time ago. I do not need anybody reminding me of my wrongs and of what I have done. I know I was wrong, and I know that I am probably going to suffer over it for the rest of my life, so please do not come here saying that. I am just going to share my story so somebody might actually learn a lesson from it. My name is Serena, and I am a 29-year-old woman. I am married to Stanley, a 30-year-old man, and we have been married for 5 years. Or rather, I should say we were married for 5 years, as we are getting a divorce now. Stanley and I live in the United States, and we don't have any kids. We were planning on having some when we were in our mid-30s. Stanley and I met in college. I remember stepping into the packed lecture hall on the first day of my sophomore year at university. My heart was racing with excitement and nerves. I asked if I could seat there, and he accepted. As I settled into the seat, we exchanged introductions. His name was Stanley, studying economics like me. We bonded over shared complaints about early classes and love for coffee. As the lecture began, I couldn't help stealing glances at Stanley. There was something about him that intrigued me, and we quickly became friends, studying together and hanging out on campus. As time passed, I realized I was falling for Stanley. He was kind, funny, and always there for me. Looking back, that first day in the lecture hall was just the beginning of our journey together. And I'm grateful for the chance encounter that brought him into my life. I will never regret meeting Stanley. He is always going to hold a special place in my heart as he gave me some of the happiest memories of my life. I cursed everything, and I blame myself solely for it. If not for the fact that I had cheated on him, he would have never cheated on me with our neighbor. In the blink of an eye, Stanley and I went from dating to practically living together. Stanley was from a wealthy family, and he spoiled me rotten. He handled the bills and treated me like a queen, even before we tied the knot. Then, out of the blue, Stanley proposed, and our wedding was straight out of a storybook fancy venue, flowers everywhere, the whole 9 yards. His parents insisted on a prenup. They liked me, and they were very friendly to me, but they were adamant on me signing a prenup. I didn't think much of it back then, but looking back, that prenup was like a secret safety net for Stanley. Who knew a piece of paper could be such a game changer? As the years rolled by after we tied the knot, Stanley's dad retired, passing the role of CEO to Stanley. Suddenly, Stanley's schedule was jam-packed, like he had a dozen plates spinning at once. He was constantly on the move, jetting off to meetings, conferences, and sales pitches faster than you could say busy bee. At first, I didn't mind. It meant I could be a stay-at-home wife without a care in the world. Stanley took care of everything, making sure money was never an issue. I never punched a time clock and had never worked since the day I tossed my graduation cap. But as time passed, that big empty house started feeling less like home and more like a deserted island. Loneliness crept in like an unwanted guest, reminding me that no amount of cash could fill the void of companionship. I started missing Stanley more and more. I knew I should have talked to him about it, but I kept it all bottled up inside. After all, he was busting his butt to provide for us. Complaining would have felt ungrateful, so I kept quiet. One day, I headed to the grocery store just a few blocks away. I didn't bother taking the car since I only needed a few things. While browsing the sweets aisle, I've got a bit of a sweet tooth, especially for chocolate, I literally bumped into the most handsome guy I'd ever seen. Now, let me tell you, my husband Stanley is a total heartthrob. But this guy was something else too. He kindly helped me reach for an item on the shelf and struck up a conversation. Jeremy, that was his name, was incredibly friendly and easy to talk to. I found myself enjoying the attention, soaking up every moment of our chat. He lived nearby, though not in our immediate neighborhood. At some point, it hit me like a ton of bricks that I was married, and what I was doing felt all kinds of wrong. I made up an excuse to leave, but Jeremy insisted on dropping me home. Jeremy insisted on accompanying me home, and when we reached the checkout counter, he insisted on paying for my groceries. I couldn't help but blush at his gesture. It was flattering to feel noticed and appreciated, especially after almost 5 years of marriage. I knew I wasn't wearing my wedding ring, so Jeremy probably didn't realize I was married. Feeling conflicted, I knew I should tell Jeremy about my marital status, but the words stuck in my throat. Maybe I was overthinking things. Perhaps Jeremy was just being friendly, and mentioning my marriage would only make things awkward. So I decided to go with the flow and let the moment unfold naturally. Jeremy dropped me off at home, and as we said our goodbyes, Jeremy asked for my number. And without thinking, I gave it to him. Deep down, I knew it was a mistake, but in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to refuse him. Jeremy even complimented the house. I felt a pang of guilt and quickly deflected, telling him that my parents were wealthy, which is why I could afford such a nice place. He seemed to buy it and even joked about me being a trust fund kid. Little did he know, the house actually belonged to my husband. Jeremy drove away, leaving me standing at the gate of my house. I couldn't help but feel a surge of happiness tinged with guilt. It had been a long time since I connected with someone outside of my marriage, and Jeremy's attention had filled a void I hadn't realized was there. Loneliness had become my constant companion, a shadow that followed me wherever I went. But for a brief moment, talking to Jeremy made me forget about that emptiness. Yet, deep down, I knew that what I was doing was wrong. I was treading dangerous territory, teetering on the edge of crossing boundaries that should never be crossed. I knew I was playing with fire, but in that moment I didn't care. The rush of excitement and validation that Jeremy's attention brought me was intoxicating, drowning out the voice of reason in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt gnawing at my conscience, but I pushed it aside, burying it beneath layers of denial. It was easier to blame my husband for my indiscretions, to shift the responsibility onto his shoulders. If he wasn't always traveling, leaving me alone for weeks on end, then perhaps I wouldn't have given Jeremy my number. It was a convenient excuse, a way to absolve myself of any wrongdoing. But deep down, I knew the truth. My actions were my own, and no amount of rationalization could change that fact. I was walking a dangerous path, and I feared where it might lead me. Yet, in that moment, I was willing to ignore the warning signs, to chase after the fleeting thrill of attention and validation. Little did I know it was a path that would lead to consequences far greater than I could have ever imagined. Jeremy and I hit it off right from the start. We could talk for hours without even realizing how much time had passed. We found out we had a ton in common, so conversations flowed like a breeze. Jeremy's funny and charming, and he had me laughing all the time. I knew I was getting in deep with Jeremy, but I couldn't help myself. Our talks felt like a breath of fresh air in my lonely life. It was like I was in too deep to even try to back out. Despite knowing it was risky, I kept diving headfirst into our friendship, unable to resist the pull of his company. As time went on, Jeremy started coming over to the house when my husband was away. It started innocently enough, with him dropping by for a chat or to help out with something around the house. But as our friendship deepened, so did his visits. It became a regular occurrence, his presence filling the empty spaces left by my husband's absence. Keeping up the facade became increasingly challenging. I had to hide any trace of my marriage whenever Jeremy came over. To him, I was a single woman with wealthy parents, living alone in a nice house. In reality, I was a married woman, and my husband's presence loomed large even in his absence. I found myself constantly tidying up, hiding wedding photos and mementos, and erasing any evidence of my husband's existence before Jeremy arrived. It felt like living a double life. Hiding everything away became a routine, albeit a challenging one. I did my best to conceal any signs of my marriage from Jeremy's prying eyes. But one fateful night, as we settled in for a movie marathon, I found myself crossing a line I had sworn never to cross. It started innocently enough, with us cuddling on the couch during Netflix and chill. But as the night wore on and the movie's glow filled the room, things took a turn. Before I knew it, we were tangled up in each other's arms, our kisses growing more passionate and desperate with each passing moment. In a desperate bid to conceal the truth, I led Jeremy to the guest bedroom, pretending it was my own. It was the only way to keep the illusion intact. to avoid the inevitable questions and suspicions that would arise if he saw traces of my husband in our matrimonial bedroom. So I would take some stuff from our matrimonial bedroom and put them in the guest bedroom and pretend as if the guest bedroom was my room. So I led Jeremy to the guest bedroom and we had sex. The morning after was like waking up from a nightmare. I couldn't believe what I'd done. Cheating on my husband felt like a punch to the gut. I wanted to kick Jeremy out, to come clean, but I was paralyzed with fear. Then Jeremy walked in with breakfast in hand. The sight of him, so caring and attentive, made my heart ache with conflicting emotions. I wanted to kick him out, to confess everything and face the consequences. But as he set the tray down beside me, his eyes full of warmth and affection, I knew I couldn't bring myself to do it. Jeremy's gestures were so romantic, so genuine, that the words stuck in my throat. How could I shatter the illusion of perfection he saw in me? How could I tell him the truth, knowing it would destroy everything we had? So I pushed the guilt aside, buried it beneath layers of denial, and allowed myself to pretend as if everything was all right. Looking back, I can't believe how I convinced myself that what I was doing was okay. I mean, deep down, I knew it was wrong, but I somehow managed to gaslight myself into thinking I could get away with it. Looking back now, it's clear as day that was a big lie I was telling myself. But back then, I guess I was just naive. Jeremy and I kept up our secret rendezvous whenever my husband was away. It became routine. Either he'd come over or I'd sneak off to his place. We were like any other dating couple, except for the fact that I was hiding a huge secret. I was married. It felt like living a double life, and the guilt gnawed at me constantly, but I was too deep in to turn back. As time passed, the divide between my husband and me became more pronounced. He started to notice the growing distance between us, the subtle shifts in our dynamic that I had tried so hard to conceal. Despite his efforts to bridge the gap, to overcompensate for what was missing, I couldn't shake the feeling of being emotionally disconnected from him. At first, I brushed off his attempts, telling myself that it was just a phase, a rough patch we needed to work through. But deep down, I knew the truth. The truth that our relationship had been slowly unraveling long before Jeremy entered the picture. His presence only served to highlight the cracks in our marriage, the flaws and shortcomings that I had been trying to ignore for so long. As my husband's efforts to reconnect grew more desperate, I found myself retreating further into myself, building walls to keep him out. It wasn't intentional, but the more I tried to distance myself from Jeremy, the more I pushed my husband away in the process. It was a vicious cycle, one that I felt powerless to break free from. Despite my best efforts to maintain the facade of a happy marriage, the truth was impossible to ignore. The gap between us had grown too wide, and no amount of overcompensation could bridge the divide. And as I watched my husband struggle to hold on to something that was slipping through his fingers, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt for the role I played in pushing him away. The weight of guilt pressed down on me like a ton of bricks. I couldn't escape the overwhelming feeling that everything was my fault, that I had single-handedly driven a wedge between my husband and me. But deep down, I knew I hadn't set out to intentionally sabotage my marriage. As my relationship with Jeremy continued, he too began to notice the cracks in our facade. He picked up on the fact that I never posted about him on social media, and I always seemed hesitant to go out in public with him. I tried to brush it off, blaming my behavior on being introverted, but even I knew that excuse could only hold out for so long. The truth was, I was scared. Scared of what people would think if they found out about us. Scared of the consequences of my actions. Scared of facing the reality of what I had done. So, I kept Jeremy at arm's length, hoping to shield him from the fallout of my mistakes. But in doing so, I only succeeded in pushing him further away, driving yet another wedge between us. My husband began to spend more time at home, and I felt the rift between Jeremy and me widening. With my husband's increased presence, it became impossible for Jeremy to come over, and I couldn't sneak off to see him like before. He grew frustrated, sensing that something was off, and pressed me for answers. Desperate to keep up the facade, I spun lie after lie, telling Jeremy that my parents were around and they didn't know about our relationship yet. I claimed they wouldn't approve, using them as a shield to deflect his questions. But even I knew that excuse had a shelf life. You can only use the same lie so many times before it starts to unravel. The atmosphere at home got tense. My husband could sense something was off, and it put a strain on our relationship. Meanwhile, Jeremy was getting frustrated with my excuses and evasions. He couldn't understand why I was pulling away from him. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying to keep everyone happy while hiding the truth. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. It was the classic move that my husband used in catching me. My husband checked my phone. I had grown complacent, not just in my marriage, but also in my affair with Jeremy. I didn't even bother deleting our conversations, and that's how my husband discovered the truth. He went through my phone while I was asleep, taking pictures of our conversations and sending them to himself. But he never said a word to me about it. Instead, he started acting strangely cheerful and began spending even more time at home. It was like he was setting a trap, waiting for me to fall into it. He started encouraging me to go out more, which only added to my suspicion that he knew about Jeremy. But I played along, pretending like everything was normal, all the while feeling like I was walking on thin ice. I convinced myself that my husband was clueless about my affair. After all, he was the type to confront issues head-on rather than beat around the bush, a trait I admired about him. I figured if he knew, he'd address it directly. But boy, was I wrong. I started going out more, telling my husband I was hanging with friends, even though I didn't have many. Instead, I was spending all my time with Jeremy. We grew close again, and I apologized for my absence, blaming it on my strict parents and an overbearing brother who wouldn't approve of him. Jeremy, being the sweetheart he was, accepted my excuses and suggested we hang out at his place instead. This routine went on for a week or two. I'd visit Jeremy's place a few times a week, slipping further into the web of deceit I'd spun. But one day, as I returned home, I noticed my husband's car in the driveway, yet he wasn't inside. Curious, I looked over to our neighbor's house, only to see my husband stepping out. That's when I knew my charade was over, and I had fucked up. The sight of my husband emerging from our neighbor's house, wearing a smirk on his face, sent a chill down my spine. Our neighborhood was known for its exclusivity and affluent residents, where everyone kept to themselves, too posh or rich to bother with neighborly interactions. It was a place where gossip rarely spread beyond closed doors. Given the lack of any apparent connection between my husband and our neighbor, the scene seemed suspicious. They had never exchanged more than a passing greeting, and there was no reason for my husband to be visiting her house. Yet there he was, with that telltale smirk plastered on his face. In that moment, my gut instinct kicked in, and I knew something was amiss. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing the truth I had been desperately trying to ignore. My husband's behavior betrayed him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from me. Without hesitation, I marched up to my husband to confront him. I demanded to know why he was leaving our neighbor's house, but he just smirked and stayed silent. He tried to brush past me, but I stood my ground, blocking his path and pressing him for answers. Finally, he met my gaze and calmly confessed that he had been at our neighbor's house to do the same things I did at Jeremy's house. I was stunned into silence. Panic flooded my mind as realization dawned on me. My husband knew about Jeremy. Every thought screamed in my head. My husband knows about Jeremy. My husband knows about Jeremy. I felt a sinking sensation in the pit of my stomach. I was in deep trouble. My husband remained eerily calm, dropping the bombshell that he had been aware of my affair for some time. With a composed demeanor, he brushed past me and entered the house, leaving me standing there in shock. Feeling completely screwed, I knew I had to confront my husband. So I followed him back inside and found him in the study. With tears welling up, I asked him how long he'd been seeing the neighbor. His response hit me hard. He admitted they'd been together as long as I'd been with Jeremy. It was like a punch in the gut. I then pressed him on how long he'd known about my affair. He dodged the question, but made it clear he had solid evidence of my cheating. My husband stared at me dead on, his tone serious. He said he wasn't going to waste time crying or yelling over my cheating. He'd already made up his mind that I wasn't worth it. He dropped the bomb. We were getting divorced, and I had 10 minutes to grab my stuff and get out. As I cried, hoping for some empathy, he stayed stone-faced. He warned me that if I didn't hurry, I'd be leaving with nothing but the clothes on my back. I made the decision to leave without a fuss. I didn't want any drama with my husband or the neighbors. Even though it was a quiet area, I knew things could get messy if security had to intervene. So I gathered my belongings and packed them up. My husband reminded me that the car was his, so I couldn't take it. I didn't argue. Instead, I ordered an Uber. With nowhere else to go, I realized I still had Jeremy as my backup plan. I leaned on Jeremy, knowing he'd offer me refuge. I concocted a lie about a heated argument with my parents and elder brother, claiming they'd kicked me out of the house they bought for me. It was a fabricated story, but I needed Jeremy to take me in. With no job and no savings, I was completely reliant on someone else's support to get back on my feet. As a stay-at-home wife who hadn't worked since college, I had no other options. In a cruel twist of fate, I soon found out my husband had beaten me to the punch. Before I even reached Jeremy's doorstep, my phone started ringing incessantly. It was Jeremy, and he knew everything. My husband had reached out to him and spilled the beans. Jeremy was devastated. He felt betrayed and hurt that I had lied to him throughout our entire relationship. He made it clear he never wanted to see me again. Feeling utterly rejected and with nowhere else to turn, I instructed the Uber to take me to the nearest cheap motel. It was a humiliating blow, realizing I had nowhere to go and no one left to turn to. As if things couldn't get any worse, I arrived at the motel, paid the Uber fare, and checked in. But when I decided to check our joint bank account, well, his money technically, I was in for another shock. My husband had drained about 95% of the funds. Sure, it was his money, but considering he knew I was now homeless, leaving me with only a fraction of what was left felt like a cruel blow. It was barely enough to cover expenses for a month, leaving me in a precarious financial situation with no safety net to fall back on. To add insult to injury, my husband decided to go for the jugular and share screenshots of my conversations with Jeremy with everyone we knew. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. My parents, my siblings, his siblings, our friends, the whole 9 yards. But in a twisted turn of events, I guess I should thank him. After my parents got wind of the mess I'd made, they were furious. I had shattered my marriage and brought shame upon our family. Despite their anger, though, they couldn't turn their backs on me. So, begrudgingly, they scraped together enough money to buy me a plane ticket back home. It's been about 2 weeks since everything fell apart, and my life is still far from normal. I've accepted the harsh reality that my husband won't ever take me back. I've come to terms with that. Jeremy has cut me off completely, blocking me on every social media platform. Now I find myself holed up with my parents in another state. My husband wasn't too pleased about me leaving town before our divorce was finalized, but honestly, I couldn't care less. He doesn't get to dictate my every move anymore. If it weren't for my parents taking me in, I'd be out on the streets. Speaking of my husband, he's made it clear he'll be sending divorce papers my way soon. It stings, but I can't say I didn't see it coming. Especially after he cleaned out almost all the money from our joint account. Money he earned, so I guess the money is his. He may have thought he had control over me, but he doesn't get to call the shots anymore. To top it all off, I've heard rumors that my husband is still seeing our neighbor. It's like a slap in the face knowing they're probably together now. Well, I say, screw them both. Honestly, living a double life might sound exciting, but it's a recipe for disaster. It's like walking a tightrope, always on the edge of things falling apart. Each lie piles up, burying the truth deeper and deeper. Looking back, it's clear where things went wrong. If only there had been honesty instead of sneaking around, maybe things would have turned out differently. But looking back just brings regrets, without changing a thing. So to anyone tempted to lead a double life, think twice. The excitement isn't worth the pain it brings. Choose honesty, even when it's hard, and build relationships on trust and truth. It might not always be easy, but it's the only way to find real peace and happiness. And if you ever have any doubts and feel like cheating, just take a look at me. I would still be back at my husband's 7-bedroom house with a home theater and a pool if only I hadn't tried to live a double life.